I'm really grateful that I chose the path that I did, because I feel like just in general, one of the perks is having more options. There's just a lot of extra work that goes with parenting that I can use for leisure activities, new hobbies, exploration, conversations with friends. So there's just a lot of freedom just in general that comes from being child free.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Child Free podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Child Free podcast. Today's guest is someone that I recently met, and when I heard about Jen's child-free life, the work that she's doing, the impact she's making, and just generally the kind of person that she is, I said, I would love to have you on to the Kids Are Child Free podcast, and lucky for all of us, she said yes. Jennifer Hofmann is the founder and executive director of Americans of Conscience Checklist, where she leads a dedicated team of nearly 30 volunteers who together empower Americans to engage in advocacy for equality and democracy. This mission was sparked by the desire to cut through post-2016 election chaos, providing concerned Americans with a beacon of hope and meaningful action. Beyond her civic engagement, Jen is an author and blogger. Her upcoming spiritual memoir is about a life-changing 500-mile walk across northern Spain. With a passion for making a positive difference and an unwavering belief in the power of community, Jen weaves together the vibrant threads of advocacy and personal discovery, shaping a world where hope and action intersect. Hello, Jennifer. I am so happy that the two of us connected recently. For those of you listening to the audio, Jennifer has such a beautiful, radiant smile, and she just like emits this lovely life energy. I actually reached out to her after we met and was like, Jennifer, you have such amazing energy, and I loved everything you had to say, and I would love for you to come on the podcast. So lucky for all of us, she said yes. Let's get right into it. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what your life is all about.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It is really wonderful to be part of these conversations around whether you have kids or whether you have a child-free life. For myself, I am currently living in Portugal. I am a writer professionally, and I do two kinds of writing. One of them is writing a memoir that is about a spiritual pilgrimage that I did 10 years ago. And I also write a twice a month publication that helps Americans speak up for democracy and equality in the US. And those are my full-time endeavors.
Very cool. Amazing. Okay, that's super inspirational. And I look forward to talking about all of that in more detail. I think what I love most of all, because I'm a Canadian, I'm a Canadian living in Germany, but of course, when that election happened, I remember it very clearly. And I remember just how disheartened I felt and how worried I felt for the whole world, of course, for our Canadian neighbors to the south. And I love that you were able to, I'm sure, have that moment of despair, but then be able to turn it into something really impactful and say, okay, what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? I want to talk to you. So part of the reason I brought you on, amongst your beautiful energy and your really interesting life experience, is that you are child-free by choice. And I'm curious to ask you, maybe you can tell us a bit about how you came to that decision, if it was a decision, or was that something you always knew that you would not have kids?
Yeah. So I remember writing in my journal when I was 13 that someday I hoped my daughter would read my journals so that she could gain the insights that I had gained and have to learn the hard way. And that was pretty much the last time I ever thought about having kids. When I graduated from college, by the time I graduated from college, I had been immersed in a lot of feminist ideology and understood that I had the right to decide whether I would have children or not. And I come from a family of really loving people, but not always the most healthy. And I didn't really want to pass along some of those insights or traditions that I had gained as a kid in my family. And so I really just decided that having kids was probably not something I would do. And I also came out as a lesbian when I was in college, and it became clear to me that having kids was going to be a lot harder anyway. It was going to be more steps. And if I wanted to be a mom, that I would have to really work at it. And as time went by, I was doing a lot of nonprofit work, which was not always profitable. And so became clear to me that my life was for making a difference, even though contributing a child to the world wasn't going to be one of those things. And I just felt at peace with that.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm interested. I've heard some people say that they feel like being child free by choice is really an active decision for them. It's
Mhm.
something that, they have this awareness, or maybe they're not so as connected with that, but it's something they actively decide. And then I've also heard women say, like, this is really just who I am. It's my identity. I don't know any other way because I've always felt this way. And so for you, do you consider yourself having made this decision, and do you remember certain points in time that stand out as like maybe turning points, or do you just like this is just kind of who you are, or conversely maybe it has nothing to do with who you are? So I'm curious to hear a little bit about your relationship with this identity.
Yeah. I think for me, it was something that evolved, and like I said, because knowing that I would have to work so hard at having a child and that it would be much more medically complicated, almost made the decision for me. But at the same, I think from the variety of identities that you just described, I think I've dabbled in all of them. That there was a period of time where I thought, well, if I wanted to get pregnant, this is what I'd have to do. I was never in a relationship where that was something that either of us ever felt excited about. And I was in a variety of long term relationships early on. So it became just something that was part of my identity that I knew probably by the time I was 30 that having kids was not part of my plan. I moved from New England in the US to Oregon on the West Coast. And that life change was more about career and exploring the world and doing adventurous things. And having a kid was going to not be part of that plan. So I wouldn't say it was ever a conscious decision, but it also wasn't something that was that just evolved organically. It was a bit of a combination of both, and I felt really peaceful about that. And it wasn't until probably my 40s where I started to realize that menopause was coming eventually. It hadn't hit yet, but I had been thinking about the fact that the time some people talk about their biological clock ticking and they're aware that there's only going to be so many more years that they could have a baby. And for me, there was a little bit of regret about I won't ever get to experience giving birth. Like that was the only thing that I ever felt any regret about. Not that I wanted to raise a child, but that my body was going to have a limited number of years that I could experience that if I wanted to. So there was a little bit of grief, I think, around that. It lasted maybe 6 months, but it was never strong enough to do anything about or offer to be a surrogate parent or anything like that.
I want to highlight what you just said because I think a lot of us, we think if we've made the right decision for us, there aren't going to necessarily be challenges. There won't be any sort of difficult feelings or disappointment or grief. And likewise, there's going to be for all of us different aspects, if we choose to be child free, different aspects of parenthood that we may feel like we've missed out on. And I've heard from many women who've chosen to be child free that the thought of pregnancy and childbirth terrifies them. And yet I'm someone like yourself where I also think, while I'm sure it can be, scary and difficult and all those things, it could also be like a really beautiful, transformative, transportive sort of experience. So I feel similar to yourself. And I think it's, we have to learn to normalize that. It doesn't mean it's easy, but this idea that we make the decision and we never ever look back, there's never any part of it that doesn't feel difficult to us. I think it's just not true.
Yeah, it surprised me when those feelings came up. It was unexpected because I really, by the time I was in my 40s, it was not anything I ever thought about. It was a done deal. It was a decision I had made at some point and didn't ever reconsider. But that awareness that my body was changing really, it surprised me that there was some grief that came up, and giving myself permission to feel it, giving myself room to just acknowledge that those feelings were there, and um, make peace with them was important. To give it some space, to give it some room to for me to be curious about it, journal about it, talk to other friends who were child free about their process. And also was more curious about women who had gone through childbirth and what that experience was like. So it made me more curious and more open about an experience that I had never had with my friends who were moms.
Yeah. Have you ever seen a baby being
And I
born?
haven't actually, no.
Is it on your bucket list like it's on mine?
I think if it were my own experience, it would be one of those like
Yeah.
spiritual transformational kinds of things.
Yeah.
But the idea of witnessing it sounds really stressful. Like if I had a friend that wanted me there, I would find a way to be strong and be there
Yeah.
with her. But I also think that there's a lot of pain involved. There's a lot of blood
Yeah.
involved. There's a lot of like uncertainty, and the medical, can be complicated. We don't have super great survival rates in the US for as good a medical
Yeah.
system as we have. So some of those things would be really stressful. I had a friend that almost lost her child in childbirth. And
Wow.
so for me, that whole process seems really scary, actually. So I don't know that I don't, I honor that it's on your bucket list, but it's definitely not on mine.
Yeah, no, it's something. I mean, I definitely don't need to or want to glorify it, and I certainly know people who've had very challenging and scary birth experiences. I guess maybe I can just opt in if it's like smooth sailing. I'm interested to know. I mean, I want to talk just a little bit about sort of what like the climate was like for you as a Gen Xer in making or having made this choice, and kind of coming of age. Because I think you're, if you mentioned, I think you said you're 50 right now, so you're 9 years older than me. Call it a decade older, and it seems like there's a lot more conversation happening right now and acceptance around like this is an option, this is a valid choice, and of course it really depends on what kind of circles we're talking about this. Of course, it's still challenging. I don't want to dismiss that, but um, I'm curious what it was like for you at the time, like, and also maybe your identity in terms of okay, being a lesbian, maybe not having had that right partnership. Like, was the assumption like, well, she wouldn't have kids anyways, or was there pressure there? Was there pressure from your family? Like, what was that all like for you?
Mhm. Yeah. So I first of all, I just want to say that millennials are total badasses. I'm such a fan of millennials and Gen Zers because the embracing of identity and options are so much greater than were normalized in my generation. So I'm kind of that in between the boomers who were really assumed to have kids and the millennials who are writing their own stories and Gen Zers who are writing their own stories. For me, it was really the decision to be a mom or not was absolutely connected to my identity as I was coming out in my early 20s. I was in a Catholic university, which was also kind of an interesting setting to come out.
Yeah.
Before that, I had dated guys, and I actually had a brush with pregnancy. I didn't actually get pregnant, but there was like about a 2 day period where we thought it might be what happened, and that was alarming. And the guy I was dating at the time actually said that he hoped that I had been pregnant because then we would have gotten married. And it was just kind of like, wow, okay, just because you're pregnant doesn't mean you're going to get married and have a child. Like there was some
Yeah.
assumptions made there in that conversation, which it was sweet at the time, but I'm glad I didn't go that route. Um, and when I came out in my early 20s, um, by then I really had that sense that I could own my future. I could
Mm.
decide, preventing a pregnancy was something that was within my right as a woman. Um, but there was still a lot of pressure for women to get married and have children in their 20s. It was still very normalized. And I had a lot of friends that were getting married in their early 20s. My brother got married way younger than I did, and started having kids within a couple of years. And when I came out to my mom, actually, the first thing she said to me was, "No wedding, no babies." Like that wasn't how she ended up being in the long run. She was very supportive of me, very loving toward my partner at the time. But it was also just it was a statement to me about where the assumptions were, the hopes
Yeah.
that my parents had for me, that I would go on to have grandchildren for them. And so it was mostly subtle. It was never actually said outright. It was never an expectation. But when I came out, my mom assumed that because I was gay, I wouldn't have kids or I wouldn't have
Yeah.
and frankly, marriage wasn't legal at the time in the United States. So it wasn't a given that I would get married. So yeah, that's really what that experience was like for me. And having to kind of disappoint my mom was hard to be able
Yeah.
to say, yeah, that's probably not going to be on the table for me, at least not the having children part. But it was already something I had decided anyway. And me coming out sort of made it clearer to her what was going to happen in my future and what to expect. But that being said, it still felt like pressure. It was still stressful to
Yeah.
let her down.
Yeah, I bet. And that's something I hear from so many people who are on the fence is they worry so much about who they may be letting down or what ideas they're letting down should they choose not to have kids. And certainly I would say one's own parents, it's at the top of the list for a lot of people. And it's funny because you and I were having a conversation before recording about Maria Coffey and her book Instead. And she actually talks about Catholic mother guilt in this decision. One more reason why the two of you, I think, would really enjoy connecting. But it's very real, and I think it's hard enough when we don't have that pressure, but when words are spoken like, hey, this is my dream for you, and I've worked hard for you to have this life that I envision as the good life, not necessarily that you would, it can be really, really hard. And so I'll ask you a similar question to what I asked her, and that is, what sort of advice would you give to someone who right now is like grappling with this? Maybe they haven't made a decision, but they feel like they're leaning towards staying child free, and yet they're really thinking like, gosh, I'm going to be letting some people down if I don't have kids.
Yeah. I heard a quote, and I wish I could attribute it to the right person, but having children is like having a tattoo on your face. You want to make sure that it's the right choice for you. And I think that that's such a like extreme example, but um, having a child means that you're committing to a project for at least the next 18 to 24 years. And that person will be part of your life forever. And if you like that person, great. It will probably be a good project. On the other hand, you might not like that person. You might love them, but you might not like them. And
Yeah.
that's kind of a crapshoot. You're never really sure how that's going to go out, how that's going to turn out. So, yeah, I think for me, I wouldn't necessarily give advice, but I would just say if you're ready to spend 20 plus years with someone and you don't know who they're going to be, how ready are you for a project like that?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think, where it concerns other people in our lives, I often look at it as, and we can, this is of course the kids are child free question is a really big one, but
Mm,
even in small ways I have to ask myself, am I prioritizing somebody else's comfort at the expense of my own? Like,
yes.
I'm putting myself in a position where I feel discomfort, and arguably if you're having kids without wanting to, that's going to be more than discomfort. But am I willing to sacrifice my own well-being, my own sort of emotional state for, because I don't want someone else to be unhappy or dissatisfied or uncomfortable? And the answer I come back to always has to be like, no, I won't do that. But I find that can be like a good test. Like,
Yeah.
am I putting myself on the line because I don't want someone else to be? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And I feel really
And
grateful because I had two aunties who didn't have children, and actually neither of them got married, and at least there were adults that I could relate to in my family who were boomers and grew
yeah.
up with the expectation that they would get married and have children and never did. Maybe they wanted to, but they didn't. And so it was really
Mm,
helpful for me to have those people I looked up to who had made different life choices, and they were great. One of them spent most of her time with my family and was my like bonus big sister, bonus mom. So that was something that I decided, when my brother started having kids and his wife started having kids, that I could be a cool aunt instead, and that was actually really a good win-win for me.
yeah. Well, that's so neat that you had that modeling in your life, because I think a lot of us still don't. I remember asking my mom a few years ago, I was like, do we know anybody who didn't have kids? Like, it, and she's like, well, I had one aunt who I think was not able to, and it was somebody I didn't really have a relationship with, but there was nobody really present in my life. And I think to have that sort of role model and to show you what's possible, and that I'm hoping in the case of your aunts, like they still were able to have some semblance of a good, happy life, or at least the challenges they face weren't necessarily because they hadn't had kids. It's just because life.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk about the question, do you have kids or are you going to have kids? I know a lot of child free women and people on the fence find these questions awkward or sometimes even rude. And they think it's really a question that should just not be asked, period, for all the reasons we might imagine. Other people I speak to, they're like, but, I don't really mind. And they just kind of chalk it up to human curiosity, or maybe it's just a form of social engagement, like, asking somebody, what do you do? So I'm curious for you, first of all, what's your thought on that broadly? Like, is that a question okay to ask, or maybe are there better or worse ways of asking? And then I'm curious, like, how do you feel when you're asked that?
Yeah. I think what I've observed is that people ask questions like that, what do you do, or do you have kids, because they're trying to find common ground. And
Hmm.
having kids is such a universal experience. Having a job is such a universal experience. Or where did you go to school? Like those kinds of questions are meant to find common ground, and they can cover a lot of bases really quickly. So I try to remember that the question is coming from a place, hopefully, of an intent to connect, an intent to find a topic to have in common and talk about. Um, because I didn't have kids, I often especially when I was younger, I really took that question personally. I used to think,
Yeah.
they're being really invasive. It's none of their business whether I have kids, or that there was somehow a judgment, um, or somehow I was perceived as being superior because I didn't have kids. That I thought I
Mm.
was better than them, or
Yeah.
it always felt a little bit fraught. And I was talking with a friend of mine who also didn't have kids, and I was just saying, sometimes this comes up in conversation and it feels really awkward. And she said, "Well, what if you bring humor to the answer?" Because I usually would just say, "No, no, I don't have kids," and then the conversation would just, go flat.
Yeah.
And there was now,
Totally.
what are you talking about? Especially if they did have children. So what I started to do was is just answer the question. I don't have kids, but please don't tell my cats.
That's
They'll be
cute.
really offended. So it was like I started to make it funny, and then I would ask about their kids or ask about their family, and turn the question around to be about them and their experience, because they clearly wanted to share. And then there was common ground anyway. So there was humor, there was
Mm.
lightness, there wasn't any judgment. But on the whole, I think, in the United States, so I live in Portugal now. I've traveled a lot in Europe. And what I find really interesting is that in the US, people usually start with questions about, what do you do? Eventually, we get around to questions like, do you have a family? Are you married? Do you have kids? In Europe, it's almost exactly the opposite. People in Spain,
Mm.
in particular, where I've spent a lot of my time, ask about your family first. And to Americans, that often sounds invasive. It's like, why are you
Yeah.
asking if I'm married or not? That's an awfully personal question. And in some European communities or cultures, asking what people do is akin to asking how much money they make annually. It's
Yeah.
considered a little bit classist kind of question. So it's just very interesting where that falls. So I think people are, again, they're just trying to make a connection. They're trying to find common ground, and I think that as long as I can keep that intention in mind, it feels um, less intense, or less invasive to me.
Yeah, that's a really good way of seeing it. And I try and assume that people have a positive intent, and to also I
Mm-hmm.
think there's certain ways that people ask things, and then more importantly how they respond to the answer. No, I don't have kids. Some people are like, oh, lucky you, or that must be nice, or good for you for making that choice, or I have friends who've chosen that as well. You can have two of mine, whatever it may be. I think it really comes down to like what that follow up looks like. But I try and generally just kind of assume the best of people and um, yeah, I mean, people will think what they want, as we do. I try and
Right.
remind myself too. Like I make judgments of people's choices as well. I try not to, but we're
Mhm.
only human.
I think my heart goes out most to the people who are trying to have kids, and are struggling.
Yes.
That to
Yeah.
me is just salt in the wound, and my heart really goes out. And so I generally don't ask that. I tend to ask
Nice.
things more like, what do you do with your time?
And I think for me, that's part of the reason I don't necessarily like me being asked, because I think, okay, who else are you asking, where it's very uncomfortable for them to answer. And I know certainly, worst of all is if you've been unable to, or you're trying to and unable to. But it's also hard when people are unsure, because it can bring up a lot more sort of ambivalence and uncertainty. So yeah, that best to just kind of steer clear, or to like feel it out. I think if you really want to know, there are ways of like getting to know about somebody's life without asking that question pointedly. So most
Mhm.
people will bring up their children eventually if they have them. So
Right.
I want to know, let's talk about what you love most about being child free, or what you sort of see as some of the benefits or perks of this child free life.
Yeah. Um, there are so many. It really is. Um, yeah, there's a long list. So I have traveled a lot, as I mentioned. In 2013, I got to walk 500 miles across northern Spain. I got to take 7 weeks to do it. I know that's unusual for Americans because most of us don't get that kind of time off anyway, but I've also had the luxury of being self employed for the last 17 years. And if I were raising a child, I probably would not have taken the risk to become self employed. I probably would have found a stable job with good benefits and stuck to it the rest of my life. I've been able to take a lot of risks and change careers multiple times because I was interested in learning something new, or I wanted to try a new place to live, or I wanted to try learning something new. So I've gone back to school a couple of times. So going back to school, trying new careers, both of those are benefits. Getting to travel has been huge. So when I went to Spain in 2013, I thought that was the last time I would go to Spain. I thought it was the last time I would walk the Camino de Santiago, which is that pilgrimage. Um, I've now walked it 4 times. I've gotten to
Wow.
travel at length. This summer, I was actually in Europe for 3 months. And I know that's not just atypical for parents, but it's also atypical for Americans. And I'm really grateful that I chose the path that I did, because I feel like, just in general, one of the perks is having more options.
Yeah.
If I want to do something, if I want to stay in my pajamas all day and eat popcorn for lunch and dinner, like, I can. I don't usually, but I have that option. I don't have to worry about putting a decent meal on the table or correcting homework, or there's just a lot of extra work that goes with parenting that I can use for leisure activities, new hobbies, exploration, conversations with friends. So there's just a lot of freedom, just in general, that
Mm.
comes from being child free.
Yeah, I totally agree. I see it as sort of like we can almost live multiple lifetimes in one life in a way. It's like, what do I want to do now? What do I want to do now for the next, 5 years or 10 years? And I mean, I don't really think of my life in those kind of periods of time because I'm like, I don't know what's happening next year. People are like, how long are you going to stay in Germany? I'm like, I don't know. Let's see. But of course, there's a lot of uncertainties, different kinds of uncertainties and possibilities of having a child. But for me, it always feels like it's like a little bit more slated out, like, okay, well, we're probably going to be here because the kids will go to school and it's going to be for this long, and then they'll be teenagers, and then we could maybe look at doing XYZ. So yeah, I like this. Okay, I'm going to go to school. Okay, I'm going to do different kinds of work. Now I'm going to travel. Now I'm going to do the Camino for the fourth time.
To
Very
move to
cool.
Portugal permanently.
Yeah. Okay,
Wow.
so let's
Okay,
talk about
great.
that. I'm curious to know, like, what are 5 things that you have done in, like, let's call it like recent memory, the last few weeks, that you would not have been able to do if you had kids?
Okay, so in the last month, I moved to Portugal. That's the first one. I cleaned out my entire storage unit in Oregon, and I packed my life into 4 suitcases and moved in with my new girlfriend.
Yay.
Yay, it's amazing. It's amazing. That's the first thing. Um, Gosh, I'll sleep in till 8 a.m., 9 a.m. if I really want to. Um, what else? You know, yeah. So 2 weekends ago, we decided to go to Spain for the day. Hopped in the car,
As you do.
like you do. It takes
So
20
cool.
minutes to go to another country in Europe. So I upped, and we spent, the better part of 2 hours looking at all the Christmas candy that they sell in Spain and choosing some of the
Yeah.
best ones to take home with us. Totally
Nice.
spontaneously. What else? Um,
You don't have to come up with
yeah,
five
no,
if
I'm
you
just
don't
thinking,
want.
like, lately there's been so much transition the last couple of weeks. Like,
Yeah.
what else? Um, I mean, so in the evenings, one of the things that I really enjoyed is that in the evenings I've been spending a lot of time reconnecting with my friends in the States, because now that I'm abroad, there's a fear that I've completely disappeared, and I can spend
Yeah.
an entire evening talking on the phone with an old friend and not worry about bedtime, not worry about bath time. That's None of that stuff is on my radar. It's just, okay, well, I'd like to go to bed by 10, so I'll get off the phone by then, and that's such a luxury, to just immerse myself in these meaningful friendships and talk about whatever we want forever.
Yeah. So good. To immerse yourself in all kinds of things, right? Like, I'm sure as a writer, you can immerse yourself in your writing. You can immerse yourself in, I mean, it's just, yeah, periods of uninterrupted time. It's a beautiful thing.
It really
Okay, you
is.
got to 4. I'm impressed, and I think you probably had a couple extras in there. So
Further,
popcorn for lunch and dinner.
right. I also have ADHD, which means that my attention span is not always the longest. It's gotten a lot better because I have a lot more structure in my life now, but
Yeah,
I think interruptions for me are really tough. And
yeah,
so just being able to do something uninterrupted is a joy for me, to be able to immerse myself in a topic read a bunch of stuff. I've been doing a lot of writing lately, and I don't have to worry about mom in the corner.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I love that. I know, sometimes as a mom, that's a wonderful feeling to know someone loves and
Mm.
needs you. But I love that I can, like you said, I can just immerse myself in the writing.
All right. So, a lot of my clients and followers know that I love outdoor adventures, especially going hiking in the Alps. But a lot of people don't know that I have quieter, more relaxing hobbies as well. And one of my favorite things to do with my time is to read. I love reading all kinds of different books. And my clients know that I usually have a book for virtually every single challenge they may be facing. That's why I've put together my free kids or child free book guide that contains 22 and counting different book titles, all about how you can make this decision on whether or not you want to have kids or stay child free. I've included books about the child free choice. I've got books about motherhood. As mentioned, I've got books about how you can make this decision. I've got fiction books in this guide, nonfiction books. There is a lot to choose from. And for every book that I've mentioned in the guide, I've got a brief description so you can learn a little bit more about the book. And I've also linked to them on Amazon so you can go ahead and purchase them. Although, of course, I would highly suggest you purchasing from an independent bookstore if you can find the title there. Go ahead and download the guide if you're a reader like I am and you want some support making this decision. I know you're going to love the books that I've shared in there as much as all of the people who've already downloaded this guide. You can find it at kidsorchildfree.com under the free resources tab, and I'll also link it in the show notes. I want to move over to this topic of generational trauma and patterns. And I know it's something you mentioned as perhaps something that gave you pause, or you thought, oh, I don't want to repeat certain things. I don't want to have kids based on maybe what some of your own experiences were. And I know in the case of parents, they'll often say that it's a chance for sort of a do-over, to do things differently, to heal past relationships or, challenges they've had with themselves based on things they've experienced, and to have new experiences with their kids, which I think is, obviously very beautiful and valid. And then, of course, there's some child-free people who say, like, no, like, not having kids is a way of breaking the pattern, like it stops here. It's also, of course, an opportunity to really focus on our own healing
Yes.
and yeah, growth and bettering ourselves, whatever that may look like or be. So I'm curious if you could tell me a little bit more about your relationship with this in your own life.
Yeah. So by the time I was in my 20s, I was already in therapy. And I have gone in and out of therapy my entire adult life. I've done a lot of personal growth workshops. I've done a lot of reading, a lot of, any of those personality tests that you can think of, Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, any of those things. I've been such a student of the soul and a student of consciousness. I've done a lot of like meditation workshops and just all of those things where I'm learning about myself and trying to unearth the patterns that are not serving me, that come from my family of origin. I try not to put a lot of blame on them. It's everybody's doing the best they can, and parents are
Agree.
imperfect. They're just people who are doing the best they
Yeah.
can. So for me, it's more about, I learned some things that made life harder early on in my life, and I've had so much opportunity to work on those things and stop those patterns. And it's really been a contrast between my brother and I, who he was raising two girls. And I I kept thinking, as I do this work, I am being a better supporter to my nieces. I'm giving them a different example of what life can look like. Not better, just different. And
Yeah.
giving them an alternative if they decided not to have kids, that they could see what it's like to um, to have those different choices and show up in a healthier way with them. And one of the things that I've noticed lately is my brother's started doing some of this work too, now that he's 48, 49. And,
Takes men a little longer typically, if I can make such a
yeah, I mean,
gendered comment.
the thing that's so cool is he's really going for it. I'm really proud of him that occasionally he'll
Good for him.
comment something about, I really wish I'd started this 20 years ago. And I don't feel smug about it. I wish that for him too, but it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I got to do this work. I got to do a lot more healing, and it actually makes my relationship with him stronger, because now we can commiserate about similar patterns or similar observations
Yeah.
from our families of origin. And but I can see that he's aware that there was a lag, that he was spending so much
Mm,
time and energy parenting that he didn't have a lot of time for himself. He didn't have a lot of
yeah.
time for that personal growth himself. And I'm glad that I chose what I did because I feel a lot healthier than I did 20 or 30 years ago. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. Well, you give me hope for my own brothers. One of them does not have kids, the other has one, and I can't attribute either circumstance to their lack of or ability to have done work. I mean, they're good men, but yeah, it's nice when the people you love and are in relationship with,
Yes.
can kind of like come together through shared understanding of shared experiences or
Mm,
different experiences, of
yeah.
course, different perspectives. So
Yeah.
that's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so a little bit more. I mean, I know that you mentioned consciousness, your inner work, sort of that spiritual landscape, and I'm curious. Maybe you can just share a little bit more. I mean, you sort of shared, but like, what do you think not having kids has meant for that? Has it allowed you to go perhaps deeper? You talk about, of course, the Camino is a spiritual pilgrimage for those who make the trip that way. So, can you tell us about that?
Yeah. And so I grew up Catholic,
Hmm.
and then I went to a Catholic university, and the foundations that I got from that tradition were about service. They were about being of service to others. And one of the things that really helped me, especially initially in my 20s, especially, was that I saw my career as a way of expressing my spirituality. That
Mm-hmm.
I was working with young people, I was with teenagers, I was in nonprofit work, and I thought, well, I'm never going to have kids, but in this way, I've got lots of kids. I've got lots of young
Yeah.
people whose lives I can be a part of and influence. And I saw that as a way of manifesting my desire to make a difference in the world. I ended up
Mm.
working with young people in a university setting for quite a number of years before I became self-employed. And again, it was I have a way, I have a this gives me a way to make a difference in the world. This gives me a way to contribute in a meaningful way. And I eventually ended up becoming non-practicing Catholic, so I ended up leaving that tradition. But the
Mm.
desire to make a contribution was always still very important to me. And one of the things that I realized is that the more triggered I am by stuff that's not personal, the less effective I can be in the world. And so my spiritual path began taking the direction of how do I get out of my own way? How do I
Yeah.
stop being taking everything so personally? How do I show up in a more grounded way and in greater service so that I'm not doing it for ego reasons? I'm doing it because I want to make a contribution. And I really think that everything that I've done since then, has it's sort of come the understanding that I've come to is that my work is to make a difference in the world. And my spiritual path is a way of getting out of my own way and simplifying my life so that I can do that. The work that I do now, especially with Americans of Conscience, so the checklist that I write every other week with my team, by the way, is it's really walking a fine line between taking a stand on things and making difficult topics accessible by a wide variety of people. And I don't think you
Mm.
can really thread that needle very easily if you're always trying to impress people or you're always trying to get ego strokes for them or you're trying to prove yourself. None of those things work very well in that setting. So for me, the spiritual work I've done is about letting go of ego, is about letting go of my attachment to being right or getting my way. And so they kind of go hand in hand. That the less attached
Yeah.
I am, the more service I can provide, the greater service I can provide to others.
Yeah. I really like how you make that connection to that work you've done and what that impact and benefit is for other people. And it's funny in my work, I often ask people like what they see getting between them and the kind of life they want, or getting clarity on what it is they truly want. And they always seem embarrassed to admit it. And they're like, "Well, it's actually just me." And I'm like, "No, no, it's all good. It's always just you." Like, I mean, so much of it's what's happening in our own minds, our own
Mm-hmm.
beliefs, the ways that we sort of sabotage ourselves. And I like that connection point of like, it's not just about getting out of our own way for ourselves. Yes, of course. But then what's that higher contribution point that we're able to make? And I like how you tie those things together really nicely. I personally, and nobody likes to hear this when they're on the fence about whether or not to have kids, but I see this question of do I want to have kids or stay child free for people who don't just definitively know as a really beautiful opportunity to be very intentional with one's life, to really have discernment in terms of what do I want, what matters to me, what kind of experiences are important, how do I want to make an impact. And so it's a wonderful thing to be able to ask these questions because they're not questions that all of us either take or have the liberty of asking. And so I'm curious for you, like, do you have any sort of questions or can you think about what an intentional sort of process may look like for somebody who is on the fence to really connect with themselves on this question?
I think identifying what one's values are is
Mm-hmm.
a really useful practice. It's something that I've actually incorporated into my work um, with Americans of Conscience. I have a
Mm-hmm.
worksheet that I'd be happy to share, by the way. That
Oh, that'd be amazing. Yeah.
yeah, so
We'll put it in the show
I
notes.
love worksheets.
Me too.
I'm a journaler, and journaling is, I guess, one of those other benefits of being child
Yeah.
free, or at least being able to like control some
You
of my
can do
own
it.
time. Absolutely. So,
Yeah.
identifying what your values are and aren't can be really
Mm-hmm.
illuminating. Of course, I've been in the nonprofit sphere a lot, and so one of the things that every nonprofit has is a vision and a mission statement, a statement of values, and all of those things are really helpful, not just for organizations, but also for individuals, for people to
Yeah.
think about what do I want my life to be? What's most important to me? If I had to choose between, when you look at that, I think the list of values that I have is almost 200 words long. It's of all of
Oh,
the values you
wow.
could possibly have. And going through that list and saying, okay, wealth is not a value of mine, but integrity
Mm.
is, or
Yeah.
love is a value of mine, but rightness is not. You know what I mean? So trying on different words and seeing which ones feel most authentic can be a
Yeah.
way of getting around to that. How do I then live my life in alignment with those values?
Yeah.
And how
Yeah.
I use it in my own work is related to if I value these 5 things. Let's say you take those list of 200 words and you
Yeah.
synthesize it down to say 5 or 7 words. I help people figure out how to then bring that into their contribution in the world. So what activism do you want to engage in, or what kind of issues do you want to engage in? But being a parent is a kind of issue.
Yeah.
Does being a parent align with those values, or is it at odds with? Does it complement it? So, and I don't think I'm sure you've encountered this too, but in my own experience, being a parent is not usually a yes or no answer. It's a how
No.
much,
Yeah.
on a scale of 1 to 100, where am
Yeah.
I in those shades of, 100 shades of gray between black and white. Um, and I think identifying one's values can be really helpful because it helps us clarify for ourselves what is most important to me. What kind of impact do I want to have in the world, in my life, during my lifetime? I had someone that once asked me the question, imagine your 90th birthday and everyone you've ever loved gathered around and there to celebrate you. What is it you want them to say about you at your 90th
Mm.
birthday, about the
Yeah.
impact you had during those 90 years? And I love going back to that question periodically because it helps me decide, do I want to do X or Y? Do I want to move to Portugal, or do I want to stay home and get a job with the state?
Mm-hmm.
Those values can help illuminate.
Yeah. I definitely agree, and I'd love to get those exercises, and we'll make sure to share those with you. And
Great.
I'm interested. I feel like I have quite a firm handle on my own values, but when you talk about 200, first of all, my indecision paralysis sort of comes into play. I'm like, oh gosh, that's a lot. And yeah, and maybe there's something that I feel like could also better speak to like who I am and what really matters to me. And I think those are exercises that are always worth revisiting because I think there's, a red thread and sort of a continuum throughout our lives, but arguably what's more important to us, let's say when we're 22, is probably going to be different than when we're 52. So
Mhm.
very cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see here. So I'm like just checking my questions. What else have I got? Um, bu- 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 bum. um, I want to just talk before we wrap up here about this idea of legacy, and also fulfillment kind of ties in with that. And one thing we hear from a lot of parents is like, well, my children are my legacy, and my children fulfill me. And what kind of legacy or fulfillment might you have if you don't have kids? And I mean, I would say first of all, just for me, it's like we have to look at how important are those things? And I would argue fulfillment is probably universal. Legacy and how legacy has been traditionally, historically defined may or may not resonate as an idea. But I'm curious for you, what do those two words mean to you? And then how would you say that those are showing up, or you're sort of like sowing the seeds of those in your child-free life?
Mhm. I think a lot about legacy. I've thought about it because I knew I wasn't going to have kids by my,
Mm,
early 20s. And there's a wonderful book by Parker Palmer called Let Your Life Speak, and
okay.
love this guy. And really it is about discerning what do I want my life to be about. And so I've always held, for many, many years, held this idea of, because I'm not going to have kids, I can choose what I want my project to be. If I'm not going to
Hmm.
devote all those hours and all that time in another human being, several human beings, I can choose what I want to parent into being. What do I want to bring birth into the world? So
Yeah.
legacy is definitely a word that I've thought a lot about. And especially as I get older, and I just turned 50, I don't know, something about turning 50 feels really huge. My brother
Yeah.
asked me right before I turned 50, so what are you going to do with the final 25 years of your life? And
Thanks, bro.
yeah, I almost cried, and then I wanted to punch him.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a great question to periodically ask oneself.
Agreed.
And I really stumbled onto the work that I'm doing now almost by accident. So when I created Americans of Conscience checklist, it was just a freaked out email to a handful of friends who were really concerned about the outcome of the American 2016 election. And unexpectedly, it went viral, and we had tens of thousands of subscribers within a couple of months. And that was such a shock to me. But within a couple of months, I thought, oh my gosh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Hmm.
I completely sidelined what I was doing professionally at the time. I quit a part time job that I had eventually, and have completely devoted my life to helping Americans speak up for justice, speak up for one another, speak up for their neighbors and with their neighbors. And that to me feels like a legacy. One of the cool
Yeah.
things about what I'm doing is that it's measurable. So I can see every week how many Americans are taking action, how many people are contributing to our cause as well as other causes. I can see the impact that we're having day in and day out, and that feels like a contribution. I'm helping people. People write me these sweet notes all the time. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you for helping me find my voice. I was feeling like my voice didn't matter in my country, and now I know that it does. To me, I mean, how great to get that kind of feedback, where most of us want to have a legacy, but we don't always get the immediate impact. We might not know
Yeah.
until we're dead that it hadn't made a difference. So for me, that has definitely become, I never thought I would be politically engaged beyond voting, and here I am leading an organization doing it. So that, to me, that's been as much a surprise as of course that's what I'm
Yeah.
supposed to be doing right now, and I'm going to do it. You know, my plan is to do it for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. It's such a wonderful and important project, and I'm grateful that you're doing it. We'll definitely make sure to share the details on that if somebody wants to subscribe and get involved and be able to follow along as well and take their own initiatives. Okay, and so I'm curious to hear. And by the way, like a couple of things I want to highlight first of all before I follow that up is with this idea of legacy. I think that can feel pressurous, just like purpose can, right? People think, what's my purpose? I think legacy and purpose are very much tied together. And I like how you say that you sort of stumbled on it by surprise. And I want to encourage people listening, if you feel like you haven't found that meaningful thing in your life, and maybe that's something that's even preventing you from making a clear decision because you think, okay, well, if I don't have kids, then what else might I do? First of all, I mean, you can do what you want. It doesn't have to be anything in particular, and you can go live your life and have a big, beautiful life, and that's it. I also would argue just by us being curious, by exploring, by doing and engaging with those things that are important to us, you just never know what you're going to stumble upon. And I know for me, it's like, I kind of think about this idea of purpose or finding that meaning in our lives. It's like a sharpening or a honing. And I
Mm-hmm.
know I have great passion for helping people find clarity in their lives. And that really started a little bit more on the career and professional front, which is super important, of course. We spend a lot of our life doing work, but it's now narrowed into this kids or child free topic. And for me, that holds even more meaning. And I feel like, wow, this really has even further reaching impact. And I see it as even bigger than this question, as really empowering women in particular to live lives that are in accordance with their own hearts and their own desires. So, but it's not like I sat in a room and just thought, okay, well, what's my thing? And if I don't have it, then like all is lost. And I agree. I think, as we age, we think more and ask ourselves more of these questions. And we also, of course, have more experiences to draw upon. Okay, so that's sort of your take on legacy. What about fulfillment? Does that even feel more scary, or as an idea? Does it feel like purpose to you, or what does fulfillment look like for you in your life?
That's a great question. It's not a word I think about very often, but when you ask it, it's sort of, I think that it goes hand in hand with legacy or purpose.
Yeah.
I love what you said, that it purpose or legacy can kind of evolve. And
Mm,
I wanted to just tell a little bit of a story about this. For me, if anyone's ever heard of the Camino de Santiago, it's this 500 miles across Spain. And one of the things that I learned when I was walking it is that you don't need a map, because there was a group
mm,
of people in the 80s who decided to market with spray painted arrows from France in the Pyrenees all the way to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. So you can actually follow this entire trail just by looking for these spray painted yellow arrows. And when I walked the Camino, one of the most disorienting things was to go home and not find any arrows. That I really wanted life
mm,
to give me arrows. And what I started to realize is that they are there, they just look different, they feel different. And for me, finding my purpose or finding living my legacy was about learning to discern what felt like a yes inside me, what felt like a yes in my heart, and starting to follow those things. So rather than like sitting down and rationally thinking about what's my purpose or what I want my legacy to be, it was more about, oh, this has something in common with something else I enjoy. Huh. Okay, and then I see it come up again in a conversation where I find myself reading the same kinds of books again or watching similar kinds of programs or movies or whatever. Like I start to see things that have a common theme or a common thread.
yeah.
They're like those arrows for me. And I think when
Yeah.
we talk about fulfillment, it's about giving myself permission to follow those arrows or take risks in my life that lead me to more clarity. So instead of just choosing something and running with it, it's more about living my life with curiosity and
Yeah.
following the things that are most interesting to me. So when we talk about fulfillment, I think it's actually more of a process than a destination for me. That that if I find myself feeling curious about something or I want to try something new, I tend to have historically tended to play my life pretty safe. Even though I have done a lot of non-traditional things for women my age, I still think that giving myself permission to try something new, give myself permission to explore or learn, and taking small steps toward it, um, bigger and more courageous things. I didn't decide to move to Portugal on a whim. I've been thinking about it for a couple of years about moving to Europe. So it seems like it was spontaneous to some of the people that know me, but I feel fulfilled because I have, you know, now I get to explore a whole new world and try new
Yeah.
things. So fulfillment to me is more of a process.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think in life, when we look to like one certain endpoint to fulfill us or make us feel good, I think it almost always sets us up for disappointment, because even
Yes.
if we do feel that in that moment, it's still fleeting. So as cliched as it is, I think it really is about finding joy in the journey and finding, fulfillment, or whatever word you choose to use, in small moments, and knowing that if we pursue those things that feel impactful or feel good or feel energizing or feel exciting or make us curious, that's ultimately what creates this bigger experience of feeling fulfilled in our
Mm-hmm.
lives.
Yeah. And if I'm only chasing after the destination, I'm going to be miserable most of the time. So I might
For
as well
sure.
have fun along the way.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. Okay, before we wrap things up, I have 5 rapid fire questions that I like to ask all of my guests. The first 2 are finish this sentence, okay? So being child free is,
Fun.
being child free is not.
Perfect.
What do you think one thing would be that might make this decision easier for women who are on the fence? Either something that could change, culturally or societally, that's a hard word to say, or just in general. What's one thing that might make it a bit easier?
To set aside everybody else's opinions for a few minutes and get quiet inside yourself and listen really deeply.
Good advice. All right. What's one thing you would like moms to know?
Wow. You're awesome. You're doing amazing, generous, selfless work every day.
Okay. And lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that piece of advice be?
I don't like giving advice because what's right for me isn't right for everybody. But if I had to give
Yeah,
a piece of
that's
advice,
advice.
yeah, yeah, there's no right answer, and there's no wrong answer. It's like take your time deciding. I think that might be the best advice of all: is take your time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer Hofmann, for this wonderful conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed all of it. You're just a pleasure and a joy to speak to. You get my own mind thinking. So much good stuff that you've shared on this topic of being child free and legacy and impact and travel. And I wish you the best of luck with life in Portugal. And I'm hoping that perhaps I can pay you a visit one day soon.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, now that we've wrapped up today's conversation, this is the part of the episode where I tell you that you need to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. And you really need to do that. And I'm going to tell you why. And that is because one of the big ways that people find and discover new podcasts like this one is through reviews. So if you yourself can go say what you loved about this podcast, why people who are on the fence should tune into the Kids Are Child Free podcast, that's going to help other people who are also wondering, should I have kids or stay child free, to discover us. Thank you in advance for doing so. I will be featuring some of the reviews in upcoming episodes, so maybe I'll share yours. You never know. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you back here soon for our next episode.